Are you just anxious for spring to get here? You're wondering, how soon can I get my seeds started for the garden? That's what I'm going to talk about in today's video and get it all cleared up for you. Hey guys, welcome back to another Slightly Rednecked video. Again, my name's Chris. If you're not familiar with this channel, I help you to produce your own meat, eggs, and vegetables from your backyard, your balcony, your deck, your garage, or heck, even a spare room in your house if that's the way you want to do it. And today we're talking about starting seeds. Specifically, when do you want to start your seeds and what kinds of seeds do you want to start indoors? As far as when to start your seeds, it's actually a pretty easy thing to figure out. The first thing you're going to need to know is your last frost date. That's the last frost date of winter when you go into spring. Now, if you don't know that already, it's very easy to figure out. Go to almanac.com. I'll leave a link below. When you get there, you'll see you just plug in or you just click on whatever state it is that you want, whatever state you live in, and then whatever city is closest to you. If it doesn't have your city listed, just pick the city that's closest to you, and it will tell you what your average last frost date is. Now, I will tell you a couple of things. That's an average last frost date. It's not 100% accurate. It's just kind of averaged out over a long time. So your last frost date may be a little bit sooner or maybe a little bit later than that this year. You just don't know for sure. So, what I always do with that is take that with kind of a grain of salt. My warm season crops, and your warm season crops are going to be like tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and melons and squash and those kinds of things. Those they don't handle frost at all very well. So I always want to push a couple of weeks past that just to be on the safe side. My average last frost date is April 15th. But it's not uncommon for us to get a little bit of frost after that. Heck, 2 years ago we had snow on May 1st, which is very unusual, but it is a possibility. So I always push a couple of weeks past that for my warm season crops. Now my cool season crops, they can handle some frost, and those are going to be things like your greens, spinach, lettuce, collard greens, cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, celery. All those things can handle some frost once they're germinated and actually sprouted. So it's you can start those right about on time. Use that as your last frost date, and you don't have to worry about that too much. Okay, so with that being said, what do you do with that information once you get it? Well, most of your seeds, it depends on what they are, you're going to start anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks before the last frost date. Your cool season crops usually will go into the ground, I shouldn't say before the last frost date, before the date you're going to plant them out. The cool season crops can go into the ground usually about 2 weeks before your last frost date, assuming they're sprouted out and actually going. You can't put seeds in the ground that early, but you can plant out plants that early, and they'll do just fine most of the time, especially if you have any kind of cover that you can put over them if it gets really cold. So I have some low tunnels out there in my garden, which is just a PVC frame with some plastic draped over it, which kind of like a mini greenhouse. So I can get away with pushing a couple of weeks even earlier than that. So like today is February 10th, and it's a little bit early for me to start pretty much anything, but I'm going to go ahead and start my cool season crops because I can put them out underneath the low tunnels and they'll do just fine. But let's see, where was I going with that? Okay. Couple of things when you're going to start your seeds. The easiest way to know for sure, go to a site like Johnny's Seeds, and I'll put a link down below for that. This is one of the best planting calendars I've seen. You just plug in your last frost date, and it spits out exactly when to start all of your seeds indoors. Now again, like I said, my cool season crops, I can kind of push those maybe a week or two earlier because of my low tunnels, but my warm season crops, I always push that about a week or two later just to be sure. You don't want to start your seeds too early. A lot of bad things can happen when you start your seeds too early. First of all, seeds need, the plant, once it starts growing, you don't want it to get root bound, the compacted roots in a tight container. So you're going to have to keep potting it up to bigger containers. If you start a tomato like in February and your last frost date's not till May, you're not going to put it in the ground till like May 1st or May 10th, then that's a long time for that thing to grow, and it's going to get pretty good size. You're going to have a really big container and transplant that up to make sure it doesn't get root bound. If you leave it in a small container, then it is going to get root bound, and you're going to end up stunting its growth. It's just going to be worse off than if you would have just waited and started it later on. Again, you're going to need to provide that plant with light, and although that's not too difficult, I'm going to talk in this video about what kind of light you need, how to set up a grow light. It becomes a pain whenever you got plants that are this big. I'm going off screen. Whenever your tomato plants start getting this big, and they're going to want to start flowering out at that point, it's a lot of work. So you're better off just waiting until the appropriate appropriate time, or even maybe just a little bit after if you're unsure, because your plants are going to do better in the long run. They're going to be less stressed and they're going to do better. So with all that being said, why do we want to start plants indoors? There's a couple of reasons and a couple of plants you don't want to start indoors, but let me start off with why you might want to. First of all, with my cool season crops, again, they can handle the frost just fine, but the problem is getting them to germinate. If I put seeds in the ground right now, there's no way they're going to germinate. It's just too cold and they won't actually get going. Now, once the plant gets going, it sprouts and it gets up about this tall, gets its first set of true leaves on it, then it's usually okay. It can handle a little bit of frost and I can plant it out at that point. But what they don't handle very well is the heat of summer. So when it gets really hot outside, the plant just struggles with that. And those, again, are my cool season crops, my broccolis, my Brussels sprouts, my spinach, my lettuce, those kinds of things. So I start them indoors so I can get a jump start on that, because it's not very long after our last frost date that it starts getting pretty hot. And it takes a while for that plant to get up to where it's actually producing fruit, where you're going to be able to harvest off of that. So if I start them indoors now, I get a jump on that. Once they get up and going, then I can plant them out, and they're going to do fine in the cooler weather growing, and they get a jump start on getting ready and getting to harvest size before the heat of summer hits. Okay, another reason why you might want to start some of your seeds indoors. With my cool season crops like my spinach and my lettuce, they can be grown in the heat of summer. You provide some shade for them and stuff like that, and they'll do okay. They'll do pretty good. The problem you worry about when it gets real hot is they want to bolt. They want to go to seed, and then they're not really good to eat at that point. But here's the problem is, again, you can grow them in the heat of summer, but it's really hard to get them to germinate when it's really hot. When it's over about 85, 90 degrees, spinach seeds, lettuce seeds, all those kinds of things, they don't really want to germinate. So at that point at the time, I go ahead and start them indoors for the same reason. Again, I can get them sprouted, get them up to size, and then plant them out into the garden. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now with my warm season crops, the biggest reason to start them indoors is because they take a very long time to get to size where they're going to be producing fruit that's going to harvest. A lot of these things are quick growing, like lettuce. It's a very quick growing seed. You put that in and it's ready to harvest in like 20 some odd days, 21, 22 days usually, depending on what your conditions are. It may go 30 or 40 days, but either way, that's a pretty quick turnaround. So if you don't want to start them indoors, you just wait till the last frost date passes, then you put the seeds right out in your garden. It's going to be ready to harvest in about 21 days. But tomatoes take somewhere like 100 days, a little over 100 days to get to where they're actually producing fruit that you're going to be able to harvest from. Now in southwest Missouri, my growing season is about 150 days roughly. So if I wanted to wait and start my seeds in the garden for my tomatoes and my peppers, which both take about that long to get ready or to harvest size, then I'm going to get some fruit off of that. I mean, they'll get up and they'll start producing fruit before the season's over. But I'm not going to have very long of a time to harvest there. If they take 100 days, I only got 50 days at the end there where I'm going to get some fruit off of it. So by starting them indoors, I get a jump start on that, and I can get that about 4 or 5 more weeks of harvest time out of my peppers and my tomatoes. There's a lot of plants that you don't want to start indoors. Most of your root vegetables just don't do well when you transplant them. Those are going to be things like carrots and radishes and turnips, those kinds of things. You're eating the root, and those things are usually, well, carrots take a little while, but radishes and stuff, they go quick. They're ready to harvest very quick. There's no reason to start them indoors. Just wait until the time's right and start them outdoors. They just don't transplant well. Corn doesn't transplant well. Peas don't transplant well. I'm not really sure why, but they just, when you try to transplant them out, they just don't do well at all. There are a couple other things that you don't want to start indoors probably, or not as early. Squash, melons, like your watermelons, your cantaloupe, those kinds of things. You can start those indoors, but you don't want to go 4 to 6 weeks before they're going to go in the ground. You probably want to go like 2 to 3 weeks at the most, because those things get so big so fast that it's just incredibly difficult to manage in a pot. So it's much better to just wait a little while longer. But they grow pretty fast too, so you don't have to worry so much about it's like cantaloupe. You're not going to get multiple harvests out of your cantaloupe. There's no reason to get it going earlier. Much earlier anyway, because you're not going to really extend the harvest. You pretty much just get one harvest out of it anyway. It's not like tomatoes and peppers that continue to produce once they're at that size. Hopefully you're kind of understanding what I'm saying. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good idea. And again, when you go to that Johnny's Seed site and it tells you what plants to, or when to plant your plants indoors, or start the seeds, I should say, there's a couple of things that it will tell you. Also, it'll tell you which ones should be sown outdoors. There's like a little asterisk next to the plant. If you look down below, it tells you that's a plant that's generally sown outdoors. So that's pretty easy. You can tell all that kind of stuff from that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what you need to get set up before you start your seeds indoors. Okay, you're going to need some kind of container, and I really like these containers, which is, you can buy these kits. I don't know where this one came from. This is an NK Lawn and Garden, but you get them all over the place. This is actually it's a Jiffy. Sorry, it's a Jiffy brand kit. It came in this package that says NK Lawn and Garden, but either way, it doesn't matter. This is pretty common at any of the big box stores. Comes with all these seed starting little trays in there, and this is a 72, I think it's 72, isn't it? Yeah, 72 cell, so you can start 72 plants in here. Now, don't get carried away, because these plants aren't going to stay in here very long. You can see these cells are pretty small. So you're only going to keep them in here. You're going to start them in here, wait till they get about that tall, and then you're going to need to transplant them out into a bigger container. What I like about this is, you've got 72 seeds you can do, very compact space. You've got this tray underneath that makes it nice for watering. So when you water things, all the water collects underneath. You don't have to have something else to catch it. And the humidity dome. Now, whether you use a humidity dome or not, really kind of depends on several things. If you're in a really humid climate, you probably don't need the humidity dome. But when you first start your seeds, you need to keep them damp. You need to keep them moist until they sprout, until they get going, and then they can handle a little bit more dryness. And this works really well if you're in a dry climate. You just stick this over the top until your seeds sprout. Now, once your seeds have sprouted, you need to take this off and remove it, and then you can just use it for another tray, set it down. You can put other things in there that you're going to be watering in or whatever. You don't need that on your tray anymore. Again, you don't need to go to this crazy extent. Plants don't need, or seeds don't need light to germinate, so there's no reason you can't just use another tray like this as a humidity dome for your plants. It works just fine. Let's see, what else? Okay, so you're going to need some kind of seed starting mix. Now, this is a seed starting, this is Jiffy brand seed starting mix. This is not potting soil. There is a difference. This is a sterile seed starting mix. You can see it's real light, real fluffy. This is basically just peat moss and perlite or vermiculite, and that's the little white specks that you see in there. That's the vermiculite or the perlite, which you can make this yourself just with a bunch of peat moss and a little bit of perlite or a little bit of vermiculite. Mix it in, but if you're only starting like 72 plants or whatever, one of these bags is like $4. It's probably more economical than buying the ingredients separately and mixing it yourself. But again, you want a sterile seed starting mix. You don't really want to use potting soil. Now, you can use potting soil if you want to, but you are going to take the chance of introducing fungus, mold, some of those kinds of things to your seeds whenever they're getting started. A sterile seed starting mix is the best. Seeds don't need any kind of nutrients in order to actually get started. When a plant sprouts from a seed, it's got everything it needs to feed that seed for probably about 10 days or so. You don't need to worry about having any of that in your seed starting mix. Once these things sprout, you're going to need to either plant them out to the garden. Once they get up and about 10 days old, 10, 11 days old, they're either going to need to be planted out into the garden, or they're going to need to be transplanted into another container, and either add, at that point you could add you could do that with a potting mix. A potting mix is basically the same thing. It's just half the seed starting mix and half like a compost or something like that. Or you could just use your seed starting mix like this and mix it half and half with a screened compost, because that's going to give your plants the nutrients they need to start growing at that point. If you don't want to do that, you can use this seed starting mix for everything and just fertilize at that point. About 10 days old, add some fertilizer. I don't use any fertilizer. I just, whenever my plants go ready to transplant, I just use a potting mix with compost mixed in with it, and that provides my plants all the nutrients they need. But if you want to fertilize, there's no reason you can't do that. You can do it either way you want to. Works fine. Okay, so when we get ready to plant these seeds out, let me talk about this. You're going to need containers, of course. Like I said, you can use this. You don't have to use something like this, though. If you're only doing a few, you can use like cups. You can use other pots. I don't have any laying around here, but these things work just great. These are cheap alternatives. And it saves you from having to pot that up a couple of times because you can get your plant quite a bit bigger. The plant can probably get about this big or so before it would need to be transplanted out of this into a bigger pot. So it is nice in that sense if you want to grow your plants a little bit longer without having to transplant them up into a bigger pot. One thing you need to do is just poke a hole in the bottom of this, and then you can just set this inside the trays or inside a, whatever. It doesn't really matter what it is, just something to kind of catch the water. All right, so to get your seed starting mix ready, you're going to need to hydrate this stuff before you start packing it in your, you want to add water to it first. If you just start packing this in here like this, and then you try to water it, it's going to want to float. It's not going to want to take on the water. You're going to mess your seeds up. And then it's going to compact down. You're going to have to, it's much easier. Just do it in a bowl or something like that. Now, one thing I do, hot water always works best to hydrate this. It'll soak it up much, much faster. And I like to use boiling water because even though this is supposed to be a sterile seed starting mix, there's probably some fungus spores or something like that in there, and a little bit of boiling water will help kind of kill that stuff, and I won't have to deal with that. So let me get my water real quick, and I'll add some water to this, show you kind of how that goes. All right, so don't go overboard with the water. This is boiling water, and I'm just going to pour a little bit in there. Don't go overboard with that. You don't want to. I need to go set this pot pan down. Anyway, you don't want to go too much, and just stir this around a little bit. It's going to take a little while for the soil to absorb that water. So just stir it around a little bit, add a little bit more, stir it around a little bit, add a little bit more, and I'll show you the consistency we're wanting out of this here in just a minute. All right, that's looking pretty good. Again, you don't want to go overboard with the water. Don't put so much in here to where it's just dripping wet. But this is pretty good. I know it's kind of hard to see on camera. Let me make sure it's not too hot to handle. What you want is something whenever you squeeze it together that it stays kind of compact. It doesn't just fluff right back up. So you want it damp but not dripping wet. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. You'll get the feel for it. You'll kind of understand whenever you do it. All right, so once we got that done, then what we're going to do is just kind of fill our trays with this stuff. And it's nothing special about the way I do this. Just put your dirt in here, pack it down pretty good. Let me get one of these done, and then I'll kind of come back and I'll do the rest of them. I'm trying to do this without making a huge mess because I'm at the kitchen table because it's too cold to be working outside today. And again, you want to pack these in here pretty good because you want them pretty compact so that they hold the moisture in real well. And also when it's time to remove them, they kind of keep their shape and they don't just fall apart whenever you pop them out of the little packets. So that's pretty good. And you're going to end up filling every one of these, or however many of them it is that you're going to fill up. Whether you're using, these kind of seed starting trays or a cup or whatever, it's all going to work the same way. It's all pretty easy to do. So anyway, let me get some cleaned up a little bit here. We'll go on and show you the demonstration of actually planting some seeds in here. What we're going to do from there. Give me just a second here to get cleaned up a little bit, and we'll go from here. All right, before I get to actually planting some seeds, there was one other thing I was going to talk about. If you want, you don't necessarily have to have a container to start your seeds in. These are Jiffy peat pellets. They're just a little peat moss, kind of pellet compact like that. When you add water to them, they expand, and this basically becomes your seed starting. This is an old one where the plant didn't germinate, but you can kind of see it expands up pretty big, and you would just plant your seed right in the top of that, and then whenever it sprouts up about that tall, you just transplant the whole thing, and it's kind of convenient to do that. One thing I will say about these is that they do dry out a little bit quicker than something like this, so you're going to need to water it just a little bit more frequently, but that's really not that big of a deal. When you do plant these out, I don't know if you can see this, it's got like a little mesh net around it. When you do plant these out, or you transplant them into a bigger container, I always rip that off. Just tear it off, throw it away, and I find that the plants do a little bit better that way. So again, you can do this in any kind of container you want. I just like these, and this is what I'm using. So as far as actually planting your seed, let's see, what am I going to start with here today? Let's see, I'm going to start with, okay, I'm going to start with some broccoli seed here, and it's all going to work pretty much the same way. These are tiny little seeds, so you want to kind of keep an eye on them, make sure you don't lose them. What I like to do is just take a pencil or something like that and just make a little divot in there. Now, as far as how deep it needs to be, you know, a 1/4 inch, whatever. I like a pencil about the depth of the eraser. Makes a good depth to kind of plant your plants out. So I'm just going to poke a hole in each one of these, make a little spot for the seeds to go, and then I'm going to put 2 or 3 seeds in each one, because chances are, you know, one of them or 2 of them may not germinate and may not grow. And then to finish it off, just a little bit of dirt on top. Just a little bit. Now, you don't want to go necessarily too deep, but don't stress out about how deep you're planting them. It's not really that big of a deal. About a 1/4 inch is about right. If you plant them too deep, it may take a little bit longer for them to get going, but it's, again, it's not really anything to worry about. You don't want to plant them too shallow either, but a little bit of dirt over the top of these. And that's about it for as far as starting the seeds. Now I'm going to go ahead and plant out the rest of this thing. Whoa! I'm going to go ahead and plant out the rest of this thing. I'm going to plant, let's see, I've got broccoli, I've got cauliflower, I've got Brussels sprouts, I've got some lettuce, some spinach, some celery, all kinds of things I'm planting in here. One nice thing is when you're finished with that, take like a popsicle stick or something like that, write on there what it is that you planted and the date that you planted it. And then you can just kind of stick this down right in the side of that container, and that gives you an idea of what it is, so you can kind of keep an eye on it. Now, what you're going to do at this point is, I always put my humidity dome on there, and I'm going to have to cut that popsicle stick down a little bit, it's too long. Put my humidity dome on there, another tray, even just a piece of something over the top of it to kind of keep my humidity in. It's very dry here in the wintertime, so I need to put something on here to kind of keep the moisture in there, or it's going to dry out incredibly fast. Put that on there, keep an eye on these, make sure that they stay damp. If they start drying out, and you'll be able to tell pretty easily, if you look in there, you can see that dirt or that soil is nice and dark compared to the dry soil. Let me get some out here and I'll show you the difference. Compared to the dry soil, which is a light brown. And you may not be able to see that on camera, but you will be able to see it in real life. Let me sprinkle some on here, you can probably tell. So you can see the difference between those maybe, where this one is dry and these are damp. So you'll be able to tell when it needs water. When it starts to dry out, then you're going to add some water. The best way to water these, honestly, is to, what I would do is remove one of these cells so you have a little space here you can get to, is pour water, about maybe a 1/4 way up in the tray, and just let it sit for 20 minutes or 30 minutes. You'll get a pretty good feel for it after a while how much water they need, but let it sit for 20 or 30 minutes. Whatever's not absorbed up into the pots at that point, just pour it off, just dump it off. And it's nice to have 2 separate trays, because then you can just take the whole thing out, set it in another tray, dump the water out. Or you can, you know, fill it up about a 1/4 of the way, set the whole thing down in there, let it soak for 20 and 30 minutes, take it out, set it in another tray, and dump the water out. But again, if you're using a humidity dome like this, which, you know, I do, as soon as they start to sprout, as soon as they start getting going, take the humidity dome off, get rid of it. You don't need it anymore at that point. One more thing to talk about when it comes to starting seeds. These are your grow lights. You're going to need some kind of light. Once these things sprout, they need a light in order to get going. A lot of people think, well, I'll just set it in a south-facing window, but that's not nearly enough light. They need about 8 hours at least of direct sunlight to get them going. If you just put these in a window and expect the sunlight to be enough to get them going, what you're going to end up with is plants that get real long and leggy, so they're all spindly. They're going to want to lay over on their sides. They're not going to be real strong. You need a good grow light. But you don't have to spend a lot of money on a grow light. What you're looking for in a grow light is 2 things: a fairly bright light and one that is pretty close to daylight. So those 2 factors on a light are called lumens, that's the brightness, and the Kelvin value, that's the light tone, the temperature of the light. What you're looking for is something around 2,000 lumens, 2,500, 3,000, somewhere around in there. That's going to be plenty bright for your plants. And you're looking for a Kelvin value of somewhere around, 4,000, 3,000 to about 6,000 is a good Kelvin value. That emulates daylight. So it will be more of a sun-colored light rather than orange or yellow or any of those kinds of things. Let me show you an example of a fairly cheap grow light that works just perfect for these kinds of starting seeds. Okay, hopefully you can see this in camera here. Let me get some things out of the way. Okay, this is a perfectly good grow light. This is just a shop light. It's a cheap shop light you can pick up from any kind of big box store. And I've just got two bulbs in there. These are both daylight bulbs. They're about 3,500, 4,000 Kelvin, I think it is, and about 2,500 lumens. So they're going to be plenty bright. But the important thing is where you put these lights. And I've got chains and ropes on them to hang them, because you're going to need to raise them up as the plants start growing. But you want them sitting just right over the top of these, just an inch or two above the soil whenever the plants first start to sprout, and then just keep them an inch or two at the most, just an inch above the plants as they're growing. You'll raise these up as the plants start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So anyway, that's a grow light. It's pretty easy to do. That whole setup with the bulbs and everything was about $20. And that's going to last you for years and years. You're only going to need it for a short while. Okay, so you got your seeds all planted out. You've got them sprouted. Then what do you do with them again? You're going to need to, at about 10 days old or so, they're going to be 10 days after they sprouted, not 10 days from when the plant, time you started them, but 10 days after they sprout, and they get about this tall or so, something like that. You're going to want to transplant those out to a bigger pot, because they need two things at that point. They need nutrients and they need room to grow. So you could go with something as simple as a cup like this, if it's only going to be in there a couple of weeks, and then go transplant out to your garden. Or you could go with, you may need to go with a bigger pot if it's going to be a long time. So like if you're going to grow your tomatoes out to, 8 weeks old or so, they're going to be, this tall. You need to go with a bigger pot, something, that big around, about that deep. You want to kind of consider about as much room in the base as tall as the plant is for the roots to grow and not get compacted. Again, they also need feeding at that time. Now, if you do that like I do, where I just mix I use a potting mix to plant my seeds out. Once they come from here into the bigger pot, they go into a potting mix, which is basically the same thing as this seed starting mix. It's just half seed starting mix, half compost. And it works great. It provides them with all the nutrients they want. If you're going to use just the seed starting mix at that point, then you need to fertilize at that point. And it could be an organic fertilizer, or you can use a chemical fertilizer. Either way, whatever you want to do, just dilute it down. Use it about half strength or a quarter strength. You don't want to burn your plants and give them too much. And then you're going to want to feed them at that point. If you're doing fertilizer instead of the compost mixture, you're going to want to feed them about every 10 days after that. So anyway, hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these planted out. I hope I didn't forget anything. Hopefully I got everything covered for you guys. Let me know in the comments below. What do you plan on growing this year in your garden? What are you going to be starting indoors? And what are you going to wait to start outdoors? If you guys stay tuned, as these things start sprouting, I'll come back and do some additional videos on that. And you guys can kind of keep up with me and follow along with me if you're new at seed starting. And we'll make sure that you have a very successful grow out period. One other thing I will mention is you don't want to take your seeds from here indoors under lights and just put them directly outside into your garden. There is a time period where you need to harden them off, which sounds like a very complex thing, but it's not that bad. You just start with, take your plants outside, put them in, the shade, like partial shade, for a couple of hours, and then bring them back inside. And then take them out again the next day, leave them for about 4 hours in shade, and then bring them back in. And then the next day you might put them out in full sun for about an hour or two, then move them to the shade for the rest of the day, and then bring them back in at night. And then the next day extend that a little bit more, 3-4 hours in the sun, back in the shade, and then back inside for the night. And you do that over the course of about a week, and after that they can go right out into your garden. But they need some time to adjust. If you just take your plants from inside under the lights right outside into your garden, put them in the ground, they're going to get sunburned, they're going to get wind whipped, they're going to struggle to get going. So it's best to do that hardening off period. But again, you guys stick around. We'll talk about that as it gets closer to time to put things out into the garden. I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these planted. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and as always, God bless.